Okay, so this is Beowulf Part III. Okay, so in the second part of the poem, 50 years have passed, and we find that Beowulf has been a good king. We're told about how he came to power after his uncle and lord Hygelac was killed in a disastrous raid on the Franks. These are Charlemagne's ancestors. We'll be reading about Charlemagne in a couple of weeks. And we hear about how Hygelac's son was killed for getting involved in the affairs of a feuding Swedish royal family. The Liber Monstrorum, that is the Book of Monsters from the Middle Ages, refers to Hygelac as being a giant. That is, it says no horse could carry him. And we think this is because a mammoth bone was found somewhere in the vicinities of his activities, and he was believed, and it was believed to be his leg bone. At the end of the poem, a lot of names are thrown around explaining the feud between the Geats and the Swedes, which the original audience presumably would have known. And in the text of this PowerPoint, I briefly explain the feud if you're interested in those details. All right, so Beowulf has been a good king. What does this mean? Well, beginning around line 2730, it says that, quote, no king of any neighboring clan would dare face me with troops. I never fomented quarrels, never swore to a lie. The ruler of mankind need never blame me when the breath leaves my body for murder of kinsmen. Seems like kind of a low bar, personally, but I told you also here toward the end, Renoir had said that nothing is going on in Beowulf's head usually. But you might notice that when the dragon arrives, we do get a moment of interiority. When Beowulf worries that he might have somehow broken natural law, we're not sure what that means, and offended God. So he's a good king, but he still comes to a tragic end. And for some, this is a big critical crux. That is the poem elegiac, celebrating the deeds of an ideal warrior and king, or is it a cautionary tale? Does Beowulf live up to Hrothgar's advice to avoid pride and greed, or does his overconfidence destroy both him and his tribe? And this is just a barrow or a who, remember Sutton Hoo, in Sweden, in the area where they believe the Geatish tribes once lived, the center of that area that some say is Beowulf's barrow. It's not been excavated yet, but someday when I retire, I might get my hands on it. Okay. So I would suggest that Beowulf is a cautionary tale, having less to do with a hero's pride than with a catastrophic breakdown of comitatus. Beowulf brings back up as he did with Grendel. I don't know if you remember, but when his men do help him try to fight Grendel, Grendel has some kind of magic skin that makes him impervious to weapons, but his men do try to help him. But his men with the dragon run away, an action that is condemned both by the poet and by two of the characters at the end, Wiglaf and the messenger. The poet says, no help was to be had then from his high-born comrades. That hand-picked troops broke ranks and ran for their lives to the safety of the wood. But within one heart sorrow welled up, that is Wiglaf. In a man of worth, the claims of kinship cannot be denied. And the poet later condemns the men as tail-turners, battle dodgers. Wiglaf tries to rally the troops. He says, I remember that time when mead was flowing, how we pledged loyalty to our lord in the hall, promised our ring giver we would be worth our price, make good the gift of war gear, those swords and helmets, as and when his need required it. He picked us out from the army deliberately, honored us and judged us fit for this action, made me these lavish gifts, and all because he considered us the best of his arms-bearing thanes. Wiglaf, too, condemns the men, saying that Beowulf had basically thrown his weapons uselessly away when he distributed them in the mead hall, and the consequences will be dire. He says, "So it is goodbye now to you and all you know and love. Every one of you, with freeholds of land, our whole nation will be dispossessed. Once princes from beyond get tidings of how you turned and fled and disgraced yourselves. A warrior will sooner die than live a life of shame." So the problem is that the Geats have been involved in a number of ongoing feuds with the Swedes and the Franks, the French, the precursors to the French. And now that their champion is gone, and the tribes know the army will not fight, they are doomed, which is basically what happens. On this map here, Gothenburg in Sweden is believed to have been the area where the Geatish tribes were centered. And of course, now it is part of Sweden. So the one problematic passage to me, and to others as well, right, is when Beowulf says around line 3077, he says, "Nothing we advise could ever convince the prince we loved, our land's guardian, not to vex the custodian of the gold. Let him lie where he was long accustomed, lurk there under earth until the end of the world. He held to his high destiny." And it doesn't make a lot of sense, at least to me, because it appears that Beowulf had no choice but to take on the dragon. Some students have suggested in the past that Beowulf gives in to the pride and greed, the very things that Hrothgar had warned him about. But again, it seems to me that the poet makes clear that Beowulf's attitude toward the treasure was, quote, "not selfish," at line 3075. And he tells us that Beowulf's one consolation in death was that he had won the treasure for his tribe. The treasure, however, is buried with him since he is the one who has earned it. Okay, so coming back to the Christian and pagan commingling that we see in the poem, we are told that Beowulf, when he dies, will, quote, "lodge for a long time in the care of the Almighty," which sounds a lot like heaven rather than Valhalla, which is kind of like a big, huge, incredible, well, mead hall or area where warriors go after death. The last lines of the poem say that Beowulf was, quote, "the most gracious and fair-minded, kindest to his people, and keenest to win fame." That is, one might see him as both, I think, a pagan and a Christian hero, sort of a Christ figure who sacrifices himself for his people. Many have pointed out that he has 12 companions when he fights the dragon. And one could say that we have a blending of Christian and pagan heroism in that both stress self-sacrifice. And this is just an example in the picture here of a signet ring. It's a big gold ring that you would have worn, and it's dates from about 600 in England, and it combines both Christian, you see the cross here, and pagan elements. You've got, whenever you have a curled beak like this, in Anglo-Saxon art, it means a bird of prey. And it could be referred to perhaps Odin's, ravens, or perhaps this idea that you would use birds of prey to to look for omens. Okay, so since the poem is unique for its monsters, I asked you to read a little bit of monster theory. Jeffrey Cohen is a medievalist and is probably the most famous monster theorist alive today. He has what he calls 7 theses, a lot of them overlap, which boil down to the basic idea that monsters have cultural significance, representing our fears or concerns, especially during times of cultural change. So he begins with the idea that monsters, even if they're imaginary, are meaningful. He says in Thesis 1 that the monster's body is a cultural body. That is, the monster represents cultural fears, anxieties, and desires. Monsters always signify something else because they're not real. They're created, they're invented. So in our case, the three monsters should point to concerns that the audiences or the poets, ranging from about 500 to 1,000, might have had. Dragons don't exist, for instance, but marauding or warring tribes that burned down farms and villages did exist. Okay, thesis 2, he says the monster always escapes, and this is simply a fancy way of saying that we see the same monsters over and over. In our case, for instance, we'll see Grendel continuously reinvented to address changing social and cultural concerns in the 1970s, and then again in the early 21st century. Thesis 3, the monster is a harbinger of category crisis. That is, the monster often represents cultural or social change. What kinds of changes were happening during the times of the poem? Well, we know that religion was in transition. We know that there were Viking invasions, and we know that there was instability in royal houses on how succession would work. That is, who would be the heir to the throne. Monster 4. Thesis 4, the monster dwells at the gates of, so the monster is different, right? This is related to thesis 3. That is, we fear those who are different, politically, racially, sexually, ethnically, socioeconomically. We often create simple caricatures of these people. Grendel and his mother are different insofar as they are heathen, they're without known lineage, and they dwell apart. They also refuse to play by the rules, with Grendel refusing to pay war guild or compensation, and his mother taking on revenge herself, which was not a woman's role. Thesis 5, the monster polices the borders of the possible. The monster is meant to keep us in line. That is, since monsters are almost always alone, they serve as a warning about what happens to those who violate our accepted customs or taboos. Grendel has no father. Grendel's mother has no husband, right? This is considered sinister and strange. Thesis 6, fear of the monster is really a kind of desire. Monsters break the rules. They represent the aggression and domination, that is, the desires of the id that we tend to hold in check. They can represent, too, weirdness or taboos and different kinds of customs that tend to fascinate us. Grendel has no remorse, which the poet points out. He freely indulges in violence, which is probably a fantasy for some of these people back in the age. Again, he lives alone with his mother, right? Without the sort of ties, certainly, but without the responsibilities that come with living in community. You can also consider how the monster makes people act to get a sense of its meaning. That is, you can look at the monster's impact. And the way people act tells us something about behavior that might have concerned the original audiences. Grendel, for instance, causes the Danes to backslide into paganism. His mother freaks everyone out so much that only Beowulf is brave enough to go into her underwater lair, and he barely defeats her. I love Norse saga. We're not reading any in this class, but man, when women take on the role of vengeance, they don't mess around. They will take out your entire family, including your children. So women's anger and vengeance was something that was very much feared. And in terms of impact, the dragon, as we see, causes the breakdown of comitatus, right? As I've mentioned off and on throughout the poem, there seems to be a concern with kin violence. In some traditions, Hrothgar's sons are killed by his nephew so that he can take power, and this might be the reference to the mead hall being destroyed by fire. A couple of the digressions in the poem also refer to families turning on each other, especially when those families are based on intertribal marriage. And one of Beowulf's virtues we hear as a good king, again, is that he never plotted violence against kin. So that's it. I'll be working on a paper this semester too, along with you guys. My research paper might be a little bit longer, but I'll report back. Thanks for listening.